The Arizona Territory in 1888 was a land of brutal truths carved from rock and baked by a relentless sun. It promised fortune, but mostly delivered heartache, a place where a person's life could be measured in the inches of water in their well. For a lone widow named Abigail Finch, survival was a daily prayer whispered into the dust. But on an evening when the sunset bled across the sky like a fresh wound, she would face a choice. A faint cry carried on the wind would lead her not to an animal in distress, but to a secret that would pit her against the most powerful man in the county. What she found would not only test her resolve, but would ignite a feud that would stain the canyons red, and what she received in return would become a legend whispered from the mesas to the boomtowns. The sun was a merciless hammer, and the land west of the little Colorado River was its anvil. Abigail Finch felt its blows in the cracks of her hands, in the permanent squint of her eyes, and in the silence of the one-room sod house she'd built with her late husband, Thomas. 3 years he'd been gone, taken by a fever that burned as hot as the August ground. Now all she had left of him was this 160-acre claim, a stubborn mule named Jezebel, and a well that seemed to get deeper and drier with each passing week. Her world was a palette of browns and reds, the brown of the parched earth, the brown of her worn gingham dress, the deep rust red of the canyons that clawed at the horizon. Today that red was mirrored in the sky, a spectacular bloody sunset that offered no comfort, only a stark reminder of the harsh beauty of a land that didn't care if she lived or died. The air was thick with the scent of dust and brittle sagebrush. From her porch, a simple plank structure overlooking her struggling corn patch, Abby watched a dust devil dance in the distance. It was a phantom, a twisting ghost of the topsoil she so desperately needed to hold on to. That soil and the water beneath it was everything. It was also everything Jedediah Thorne wanted. Thorne was a man carved from the same unforgiving rock as the territory itself. He ran a sprawling cattle empire, the T-Bar Ranch, and his herds were thirsty. He'd bought up or run off nearly every small homesteader in the valley, his methods as blunt and effective as a branding iron. He'd come to her porch twice. The first time he'd been almost charming a wolf in a well-tailored duster, his voice a low rumble as he made a paltry offer for her land. A woman alone, Mrs. Finch. He'd said his eyes the color of a winter sky. This is no place for you. Take my offer. Go back east. Buy yourself a nice little house in a town with cobblestones and neighbors. She had refused her voice, quiet but firm. My husband and I put our souls in this ground, Mr. Thorne. It's not for sale. The second time the charm was gone, stripped away to reveal the raw ambition beneath. His face was a thundercloud. That well of yours is the deepest artery in this valley. My cattle need it. Don't be a fool, Abigail. Pride is a poor substitute for water. He'd practically spat her first name, a violation that felt as invasive as if he'd stepped inside her home. His departure had been punctuated by a thinly veiled threat. Accidents happen out here. Snakes, fires. Loneliness can make a person careless. Now every shadow seemed to hold the glint of a snake's eye. Every gust of wind sounded like the whisper of a match. His men, rough riders with cruel smirks, made a point of riding the edge of her property line, their presence a constant low-grade fever of intimidation. The sheriff in the nearby town of Red Creek, a man named Brody with a gut full of Thorne's whiskey and pockets full of his coin, had made it clear she was on her own. Abby pushed a stray strand of sweat-dampened blonde hair from her forehead and stood up, her joints aching. The day's work was done. The chickens were cooped, Jezebel was in her lean-to, and the horizon was swallowing the last sliver of sun. It was the quietest time of day, a time when the vastness of the landscape could feel either like freedom or a prison. For Abby, it was usually the latter. That's when she heard it. It wasn't the yip of a coyote or the screech of a hawk. It was thin, reedy, and distressingly human, a child's cry. She froze her hand, gripping the rough-hewn porch rail. Her gaze swept the darkening expanse. Nothing. The sound was gone, likely just a trick of the wind playing through the rock formations. She told herself that. It was easier. The nearest neighbors were miles away, and they were childless. The Hopi reservation was a good day's ride north across treacherous terrain. No sensible person would have a child out here this close to nightfall. She turned to go inside the heavy wooden door, a promise of sanctuary. Then it came again, sharper this time, a clear spike of pain and fear that pierced the evening calm. It came from the west towards the broken country of arroyos and thorny mesquite, where Thorne's men sometimes rode. Every instinct screamed at her to ignore it. It was not her business. It was trouble, and trouble was the one thing she had in abundance. Thorne's warning about accidents echoed in her mind. What if this was a trap, a lure to draw her out? But the memory of Thomas's fever-bright eyes of her own child, lost before it ever drew breath, rose like a ghost. She couldn't shake the image of a mother somewhere, her heart tearing in two, listening for a cry that didn't come. Damn it all, she whispered to the indifferent twilight. She strode back into the sod house, her movements now decisive. She grabbed her old Winchester rifle not for hunting, but for the two-legged predators that roamed this land. From the medicine chest she took bandages, a bottle of carbolic acid, and a small flask of laudanum. She slipped a canteen of precious water over her shoulder. Whatever was out there, it was hurt. Stepping back out onto the porch, she paused one last time. The sky was now a deep, bruised purple, the first stars beginning to prick the darkness. The cry came a third time, weaker now, almost a sob. It was a sound no decent person could ignore. And whatever else this land had beaten out of her, Abigail Finch was still a decent person. With the Winchester cradled in her arms, she stepped off her porch and walked towards the sound, into the looming shadows of a blood-red sunset. The landscape transformed as she left the relative safety of her cleared land. What looked like rolling hills from her porch became a treacherous maze of dry washes and thorny gullies. The ground baked hard as pottery crumbled into loose scree under her worn leather boots. Each step was a calculated risk, a potential turned ankle that could leave her stranded. The air grew cooler, and the scuttling sounds of nocturnal creatures began to fill the silence between the gusts of wind. She called out her voice, feeling small against the immense emptiness. "Hello, is someone there?" Only the wind answered, mocking her with its sibilant whisper through the sagebrush. She pressed on, guided by the memory of the cry, her senses on high alert. Her eyes scanned the oppressive shadows for the glint of a rifle barrel or the silhouette of a man on horseback. Thorne's presence felt like a physical weight on the air. After a 20-minute walk that felt like an hour, she found the tracks. They were small, the prints of bare feet. A child, for certain. The tracks were erratic, weaving back and forth, as if lost, before heading straight for a dense thicket of mesquite and catclaw acacia that choked a narrow arroyo. As she drew closer, a low, whimpering sound reached her. It was the sound of pain, held in check of fear, so great it had exhausted the ability to scream. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said softly, her voice pitched to be as unthreatening as possible. "I heard you cry out. I've come to help." She pushed aside a thorny branch, the spines catching on her sleeve. And then she saw him. He was a small boy, no more than 6 or 7 years old. His skin was the color of rich earth, and his straight black hair was matted with dust and sweat. He wore only a simple breechcloth, He was Hopi, but it was not his heritage that made Abby's breath catch in her throat. It was the thing that held him. His right leg was trapped in the cruel, rusted teeth of a coyote trap. It was an iron-jawed monster, the kind ranchers used with a heavy chain bolted to a stake driven deep into the ground. The metal teeth had bitten through the flesh of his calf, and dark blood stained the ground around him. He wasn't crying anymore. His dark, intelligent eyes were wide with terror and pain fixed on her and the rifle she carried. He was a cornered animal ready to fight, despite the hopelessness of his situation. "Easy now," Abby murmured, slowly lowering the Winchester and setting it on the ground well away from her. She held up her empty hands. "Easy. My name is Abigail. I'm here to help get that thing off you." The boy said nothing, just watched her with an unnerving stillness. She could see the faint tremor running through his small body. This close, she saw the intricate patterns of a small beaded amulet around his neck. She knelt carefully, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. "This is going to hurt," she said, her voice full of a sympathy that needed no translation. "But we have to get it open." The trap was an old, powerful model. Prying the jaws apart with her bare hands was impossible. She needed leverage. Her eyes scanned the area. A few feet away lay a sturdy, sun-bleached limb of ironwood, heavy and dense. It would have to do. She retrieved the branch, her heart pounding. The boy flinched as she approached again, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "It's all right," she soothed, showing him the wood. "See, I'm going to use this to open it." She positioned the end of the ironwood branch between the handles of the trap's jaws. Planting her feet, she put all of her weight and strength into forcing them apart. The metal groaned in protest. Sweat beaded on her forehead, stinging her eyes. For a moment, she didn't think she could do it. The spring was too strong. Then, with a final, desperate heave, the jaws gave way. They opened just a few inches, but it was enough. Now she grunted. "Pull your leg out, quick!" The boy, understanding her intent, yanked his leg free. The moment the pressure was gone, Abby lost her purchase, and the trap slammed shut with a sickening clang that echoed in the arroyo. She stumbled back, breathing heavily, her muscles screaming. The child lay on the ground, clutching his bleeding leg, his face a mask of agony. Abby scrambled to his side with her medical supplies. Let me see it." The wound was ugly. 2 deep semicircular gashes were weeping blood, and the flesh was already beginning to swell and discolor. Infection was the real enemy now. Without cleaning, he could lose the leg or his life. "This will sting," she warned, uncorking the carbolic acid. She diluted it with a bit of precious water from her canteen, then gently but firmly began to clean the wound. The boy hissed in pain, his knuckles white where he gripped the dirt, but he did not cry out. He endured it with a stoicism that shamed men 3 times his age. Abby worked quickly, her hands sure and steady. She bandaged the leg tightly with clean strips of linen, creating a thick pressure dressing. When she was done, she offered him the canteen. He looked at it then, at her suspicion, still warring with need in his eyes. "Water," she said, pointing to her lips. "Drink." He took it and drank long and deep. He was severely dehydrated. When he handed it back, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the first sign of trust. Now came the next problem. He couldn't walk. She was not strong enough to carry him the whole way back to her homestead. And to leave him here to get help was to leave him for the coyotes, or worse, for whoever set this trap. "Can you tell me your name?" she asked gently. He remained silent, his gaze distant. He was likely in shock. She knew she had to get him moving. "All right, we're going to get you home. My home. It's warm, safe." She looked around, an idea forming. Using her knife, she cut away the sleeve of her own dress, then used it to tie the splinting branch to his injured leg, immobilizing it against his thigh. It was a crude solution, but it might keep the wound from jostling too much. "I'm going to help you up," she explained, using gestures. "You put your arm over my shoulder. We'll walk together, one step at a time." He seemed to understand. With a great deal of effort and a few sharp intakes of breath from the boy, they managed to get him upright. He was light, but it was still an awkward, grueling burden. He leaned heavily on her, his small body radiating heat and pain. Thus began the slow, agonizing journey back to the sod house. Every step was a struggle. The darkness was complete now, save for a sliver of moon. Abby picked up her rifle, and they shuffled forward, a strange, wounded pair, moving through the hostile night. They had been moving for what felt like an eternity, when Abby heard a new sound. Hoofbeats. Several horses moving fast from the north, from the direction of the Hopi lands. A search party. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. How would this look? A white woman carrying a rifle, dragging an injured Hopi child through the dark. They wouldn't know she had saved him. They would see an abduction, a kidnapping. In this tense territory, accusations flew faster than bullets, and judgment was often delivered on the spot. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer. A moment later, 3 riders crested a nearby ridge, their forms silhouetted against the starry sky. They were Hopi, their traditional dress, unmistakable even in the gloom. They saw her. The lead rider let out a sharp cry, and in an instant, all 3 were galloping down the slope towards them, rifles raised. Abby's heart hammered against her ribs. She held the boy tighter, shielding him with her own body. This was it. Her act of kindness was about to get her killed. The riders bore down on them like a storm dust, flying from their ponies' hooves. Abby stood her ground, her body a shield for the boy, her mind racing. Running was futile. Shouting would be lost in the thunder of their approach. All she could do was wait and pray they saw the truth before they pulled their triggers. The lead rider, a man with a stern, weathered face and long hair held back by a simple cloth band, reined his horse to a dramatic halt just feet away. The animal reared its eyes wild. The man's rifle was leveled squarely at Abby's heart. His 2 companions fanned out, flanking her, their own weapons ready. Tiva, the lead rider, exclaimed, his eyes finding the boy. Relief and fury warred on his face. He dismounted in one fluid motion, his gaze shifting from his son, for it was surely his son to Abby, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure suspicion. He was in a trap. Abby said, her voice shaking slightly but clear. A coyote trap. I was bringing him to my home to tend his leg. The man ignored her words. He spoke rapidly to the boy in the Hopi language. The child, Tiva, answered weakly, his small voice barely a whisper. He gestured with his head towards his bandaged leg, then back to Abby. The man whose name she would learn was Honovi knelt and gently touched the crude bandage. His expression was unreadable, a mask of stone. He looked at the discarded, bloodied pieces of linen from her medical kit, then at the sleeve missing from her dress. His sharp eyes darted to the Winchester she still held. Slowly, carefully, Abby leaned the rifle against her leg and held up her empty hands. "I heard him cry out," she repeated. The trap was back in the arroyo. It belongs to a white man, a rancher. Honovi's gaze was piercing, searching her face for any sign of deception. In the tense silence, one of the other men dismounted and retrieved the canteen from her shoulder. He sniffed it. "Water," he said to Honovi in accented English. Honovi looked back at his son. Tiva spoke again, a longer stream of words, this time his gaze fixed on his father. As he spoke, a subtle shift occurred in Honovi's rigid posture. The barest flicker of doubt crossed his features. He looked at the trap's location, which Tiva was now pointing towards, then back at the woman who stood before him, dishevelled, unarmed, and protecting his child. Without another word, Honovi lifted Tiva into his arms, as if he weighed nothing. The boy winced, but buried his face in his father's shoulder. Honovi turned to one of his companions and issued a quiet command in their native tongue. The man nodded, mounted his horse, and galloped off into the darkness back towards the arroyo she'd indicated, to confirm her story. Honovi then turned his gaze back to Abby. The rifle was still aimed at her by the remaining rider. The air was thick with unspoken threats. "You live nearby?" Honovi asked. His English was formal, heavy with an accent, but clear. "Yes. My homestead. It's just over that rise," she said, pointing. "The leg needs proper care. It's a deep wound. It needs to be kept clean. I have more supplies there. Hot water." Honovi considered this for a long moment. His people's experience with white settlers had been a long, bitter history of broken promises and violence. Trust was a currency they no longer possessed. But his son was injured, and the woman's story supported by the evidence and his son's own words was starting to hold the ring of truth. "We will go to your house," he stated. It was not a request. He mounted his pony with Tiva held securely in front of him. The other rider kept his rifle trained on Abby as she retrieved her Winchester. She walked ahead of them, a prisoner in all but a name, leading the way back to her own home. The short journey was agonizing, the silence broken only by the plodding of hooves and the chirping of crickets. When the dim light of the lantern she'd left burning on her porch came into view, she saw Honovi survey her small, hard-scrabble claim. It was a poor place, a place of struggle, not wealth. It did not look like the home of someone who would steal a child for ransom. Inside, the single room was sparse but clean. A simple bed, a rough-hewn table, a stone hearth. Honovi laid Tiva gently on her bed. The boy looked exhausted but safe, his eyes already heavy with sleep. Abby immediately set a pot of water on the hearth to boil. She laid out her remaining bandages, her bottle of carbolic, and a small jar of healing salve, made from comfrey and yarrow, a recipe her grandmother had taught her. Honovi watched her every move, his posture rigid, his hand never far from the knife on his belt. The second rider stood guard by the door, a silent, intimidating sentinel. The air was thick with tension. This was not an alliance. It was a ceasefire, fragile and conditional. The third rider returned just as the water began to steam. He spoke quietly to Honovi, confirming he had found the trap, the ironwood branch, and Abby's tracks leading to it. He also confirmed the trap was the type used by Thorne's men. The news seemed to settle something in Honovi. The overt hostility in his eyes receded, replaced by a guarded watchfulness. He gave a curt nod. "You spoke the truth." "I told you I did." Abby replied, not with accusation, but with a simple weariness. She spent the next hour carefully unwrapping, cleaning, and redressing Tiva's wound with the hot water and fresh bandages. Honovi watched her work, his sharp eyes missing nothing, the gentleness of her touch, the efficiency of her movements. He saw not a captor, but a healer. When she was finished, Tiva was fast asleep, his breathing deep and even. Abby stood up, wiping her hands on her apron, her back aching with a fatigue that was bone deep. "He should stay here tonight," she said quietly. Moving him again might reopen the wound. Honovi looked at his sleeping son, then at Abby. He gave another short, sharp nod. He walked to the door and spoke to his companions. They took the horses to her lean-to, sharing the small space with Jezebel, and began to make a small, smokeless fire outside. They were staying. Honovi did not leave the sod house. He took up a position in the corner, sitting on the floor with a blanket around his shoulders, his gaze alternating between his son and the woman who had saved him. He did not sleep. He watched a silent guardian in the house of a stranger. Abby, too, exhausted to feel intimidated any longer, simply accepted it. She took a spare blanket and lay down on the rag rug before the hearth, the warmth of the embers a small comfort. She was sharing her home with armed men. She did not know men who had been ready to kill her an hour before. Yet strangely, she felt safer than she had in months. Just before dawn, as the first grey light began to silhouette the windows, another sound broke the stillness. Heavy hoofbeats, several riders approaching fast. But these were not the light, quick steps of Hopi ponies. This was the sound of heavy American horses shod in iron. Abby was instantly awake, her heart leaping into her throat. She looked at Honovi. He was already on his feet, his expression grim. He knew that sound too. Jedediah Thorne had come calling. Abby scrambled to the door and peered through a crack. In the growing light, she saw Thorne himself on his big black gelding, flanked by two of his hard-faced ranch hands. And with them, looking uncomfortable and out of place, was Sheriff Brody. Thorne's eyes were fixed on the Hopi horses near her lean-to. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He had seen the horses, and he had drawn his own conclusions. Abigail Finch Thorne's voice boomed, shattering the morning peace. "By the authority of Sheriff Brody, I'm ordering you to come out. We have reason to believe you're harboring a fugitive and colluding with savages against the good people of this county." Inside the small house, Honovi drew his knife, its blade catching the faint light. Abby looked from the armed, angry men outside to the proud, resolute father inside, and knew that the fragile peace of the night was about to be broken by a storm of violence. The accusation hung in the air as foul as the smell of a tannery. Colluding with savages. It was a charge designed to incite to turn any shred of public sympathy against her. Thorne wasn't just trying to intimidate her. He was trying to legally and socially obliterate her. Abby's mind raced. If she stayed inside Thorne, and the sheriff would have all the justification they needed to storm her home. If she went out, she faced them alone. She glanced at Honovi. His face was a thundercloud of controlled rage. He understood Thorne's game perfectly. "Stay with your son, Abby," said her voice, a low, urgent command. "Do not show yourself." "Not yet." Honovi's eyes questioned her, but he saw the resolve in her face. He gave a single sharp nod and moved back toward the bed, where Tiva still slept, positioning himself out of sight from the doorway. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, Abby pushed the heavy door open and stepped onto her porch. She held her hands out to her sides, empty, a deliberate show of non-aggression. The morning air was cool, but her skin felt hot with adrenaline. "Sheriff Brody," she said, her voice clear and steady as she addressed the lawman, deliberately ignoring Thorne. "There's no fugitive here. What is the meaning of this Sheriff Brody, a portly man whose face was perpetually flushed from drink, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle? He couldn't quite meet her gaze. "Now, Abigail," he began, his tone placating. "We got a report. One of Mr. Thorne's men saw Hopi riders heading for your claim late last night. It's my duty to investigate any unusual activity." "Unusual activity," Thorne cut in his voice, dripping with sarcasm. He nudged his horse forward. "I'd call it more than unusual. I'd call it a conspiracy. First you refuse to sell, then you start welcoming their kind onto your land. What did they promise you, a share of what they pilfer from honest ranchers like me, your man Abby?" said her eyes locking with Thorne's cold and hard, failed to report that he also set an illegal steel trap on my property line. A trap that nearly tore a child's leg off. This gave them pause. Brody's eyebrows shot up, and even Thorn's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second. "A child," Brodie asked, glancing at Thorn. Lies Thorn spat, recovering quickly. A desperate story from a desperate woman. There was no trap. She's sheltering a thief, most likely. Probably the same one who's been running off my yearlings. His name is Tiva." Abby's voice rang out clear and defiant. "He is 7 years old. His father is with him. They are in my home because the boy was injured and needed care. His father is a man named Honovi. He is not a fugitive. He is a father who was searching for his lost son." She turned her gaze back to the sheriff. "If you are here to uphold the law, Sheriff, then I demand you arrest Jedediah Thorn for endangerment and for setting a trap on federal homestead land. That is the law, is it not?" The challenge hung in the air. Brodie was trapped. To ignore her was to show his corruption plainly. To act on it was to defy the man who owned him. He licked his lips, his eyes darting between Abby and Thorn. From inside the house, a new voice emerged, deep and resonant. "The woman speaks the truth." Honovi appeared in the doorway. He was not holding a weapon. He stood tall and straight, his presence radiating an authority that had nothing to do with a tin star or a deed of land. It was the ancient authority of a leader and a father. "My son Tiva carries the mark of the iron trap on his leg," Honovi said, his eyes fixed on Sheriff Brodie. "The trap was staked on this land. My men found it where she said it would be. This is the truth. If you are a man of law, you will see it." Thorn's face contorted with fury. The situation was slipping from his grasp. His simple plan to paint Abby as a crazed sympathizer was being dismantled by the calm, dignified testimony of the very man he'd labeled a savage. "This is a farce," Thorn roared. "You're going to take the word of an Indian over a white man over me." Before Brodie could answer, Honovi's companions emerged from the side of the house, leading their ponies. They moved with a quiet, deliberate confidence that was more intimidating than any overt threat. They were outnumbered, but they were not afraid. Sheriff Brodie looked at the scene, a resolute homesteader, 3 determined Hopi men, and a furious cattle baron. His courage, always a shallow well, ran dry. This was becoming far too complicated. It smelled of a federal matter of marshals and inquiries, things that made a small-town sheriff's life difficult. "There ain't no proof of who set any trap," Brodie declared, his voice taking on a false bluster. "And there ain't no fugitive, so there ain't no crime to be investigated here. This is a civil dispute. Y'all sort it out yourselves." He tipped his hat curtly. "Mrs. Finch, Mr. Thorn, a good day to you." Without a backward glance, he turned his horse and trotted away, leaving Thorn and his men alone to face Abby and her unexpected allies. Thorn was incandescent with rage. He had been publicly undermined and then abandoned by his own puppet. He glared at Abby, his eyes promising retribution. "This isn't over, Abigail," he snarled, his voice low and venomous. "You've made an enemy you can't afford. This land will be mine. I'll see you starve on it first." He wrenched his horse's reins, wheeling the animal around so sharply it snorted in protest, and galloped away, his men trailing behind him like vultures. In the sudden silence, Abby felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. She leaned against the porch rail, her knees weak. Honovi stepped forward, his expression still stern, but the hostility was gone, replaced by something else. "Respect. You have a strong spirit," he said. It was the highest of compliments. "I'm just stubborn," she replied with a shaky smile. Later that morning, Honovi deemed Tiva well enough to travel, albeit carefully. He tried to offer Abby payment, a fine silver and turquoise bracelet from his own wrist. Abby held up a hand, refusing it. "No, I did what anyone should have done. There is no payment for that. Onovi studied her for a long moment, then nodded, a deep understanding passing between them. He slid the bracelet back onto his arm. He spoke to his son, who looked at Abby with his large, dark eyes, and whispered a single Hopi word that she didn't understand, but felt in her heart. "Thank you." She watched them ride north, a small procession, disappearing into the shimmering heat haze. For the rest of the day, an unnerving quiet settled over the homestead. The confrontation had left her drained, and Thorn's threat echoed in the silence. She felt more alone than ever. She slept fitfully, the Winchester propped by her bed. The next morning she awoke with the dawn and stepped outside to begin her chores. She stopped dead on her porch, her hand flying to her mouth. The plank floor was covered in gifts. It was not a treasure of gold or silver. It was a treasure of life. There were 3 large, intricately woven baskets, filled to the brim with blue corn beans and dried squash. Beside them lay a stack of peaky bread, thin as paper, and rolled into scrolls. There was a beautiful black-on-white clay pot, a masterpiece of Hopi artistry, filled with fresh water. And draped over the porch railing were 2 thick, warmly woven wool blankets, their patterns telling stories of rain clouds and corn stalks. It was a statement. It was survival. It was enough food to last her through the winter. It was a message to anyone watching, and she knew Thorn's men would be watching, that Abigail Finch was not alone. She was under the protection of the Hopi. Tears welled in Abby's eyes as she touched the rough texture of a blanket. This was Honovi's payment. Not a trinket of silver, but the gift of life of community. It was a debt paid with a respect that money could never buy. The porch, once a symbol of her isolation, was now a testament to an alliance forged in crisis. But as she looked out at the vast, contested land, she knew this display of friendship would not deter Jedediah Thorn. It would enrage him. The gifts were a shield, but they were also a target, and Thorn's next move, she suspected, would be far more dangerous than a simple trap in the dirt. Far to the south, in the territorial capital, a telegram was already on its way. Reports of rising tensions between the T-Bar Ranch and the Hopi Nation, centered on a disputed homestead, had finally reached the desk of Deputy U.S. Marshal Everett Shaw. A man who, unlike Sheriff Brody, could not be bought. The storm was far from over. It was just gathering strength. For 2 weeks, an uneasy peace settled over the valley. It was the kind of quiet that precedes a thunderstorm, heavy and charged. Abby saw Thorn's riders on the distant ridges, their silhouettes like patient predators, but they kept their distance. The gifts on her porch remained untouched, a silent, powerful symbol that even Thorn was hesitant to defy directly. Abby worked her land with a renewed sense of purpose. The baskets of food, a constant reminder that she was no longer fighting this battle entirely on her own. The peace was broken by the arrival of a stranger. He was a tall, lean man with a square jaw and weary eyes that seemed to have seen too much of the territory's ugliness. He rode a tired-looking buckskin and wore the plain, functional clothes of a traveler, but the Colt peacemaker, holstered low on his hip, was worn with the ease of long practice. On his vest was a glint of silver, the star of a deputy U.S. Marshal. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat as he reined in before her porch. "Name's Everett Shaw, Deputy U.S. Marshal. I've been sent down from Prescott to look into some disagreements in this area." Abby felt a surge of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. Here, finally, was a lawman, not in Thorn's pocket. She invited him onto the porch, and over a cup of precious water from the Hopi pot she told him everything. She left nothing out: Thorn's threats, the trap Tiva's injury, the confrontation with Sheriff Brody, and the gifts from the tribe. Marshal Shaw listened intently, his gaze missing nothing. He inspected the Hopi pottery and blankets with a professional curiosity. "Thorne's been a burr under the territorial government's saddle for years," he said, when she'd finished. "He pushes, he bullies, but he's always been careful to stay just inside the lines of the law. This trap, though, that's a federal crime on homestead land. Problem is, it's your word, and the Hopi's against his." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "And we both know whose word carries more weight in a courtroom around here." "So you can't do anything?" Abby asked, her hope beginning to fade. "I didn't say that," Shaw corrected her. "I said it's difficult. Thorne's getting reckless. Men like that, when they get backed into a corner, they make mistakes. I'm going to be staying in the area, watching, waiting for him to make one." Thorne, however, was not a man to wait for events to unfold. He was a man who created them. The public alliance between Abby and the Hopi had enraged him, making a direct assault on her politically dangerous. So he devised a more sinister plan, one that would destroy both of his problems at once. He would create a catastrophe and pin the blame squarely on the tribe, using Abby as the catalyst. His plan was devilishly simple: a cattle stampede. His vast herd was grazing in the high pasture bordering the canyon lands. To the north, nestled in a valley protected by the mesas, lay the Hopi's winter cornfields, their primary source of sustenance. A stampede through that valley would be an act of annihilation, ensuring a winter of starvation, and forcing the tribe to either move or become dependent on government rations, breaking their independence. His henchman, a hardened drover named Booker, was tasked with setting the charge. But Booker had been one of the men with Thorne that morning at Abby's cabin. He had seen the look on her face, the quiet dignity of Honovi. More than that, he had a young son of his own back in Texas. The thought of a child in one of their traps had been eating at him. This new order to deliberately cause the starvation of women and children was a line he wasn't sure he could cross. One night, driven by a guilty conscience and a quart of cheap whiskey, Booker rode not towards the herd, but towards Abby's homestead. He approached, cautiously staying in the shadows. "Mrs. Finch," he hissed from the darkness. Abby came to the door, Winchester in hand. "Who's there? Don't shoot. It's Booker," from the T-bar. He stepped into the faint moonlight, his hands raised. "I ain't here to make trouble. I'm here to warn you." His words tumbled out, laced with fear and liquor. He told her of Thorne's plan, the stampede timed for the following night, and the intent to blame it on a fire carelessly set by the Hopi, who had been emboldened by their new white friend. They would even plant evidence near the cornfields. "He's gone crazy, Mom," Booker finished, his voice trembling. "This ain't ranching. This is murder." He then wheeled his horse and vanished back into the night, a man fleeing his own demons. Abby's blood ran cold. She had to warn them. But the mesas were a day's ride away. She would never make it in time. Then she remembered something Honovi had told her during that long night in her cabin. He had spoken of the old ways of the paths his people used, shortcuts through the labyrinthine canyons that only they knew. He had described a narrow, hidden passage known as Echo Pass, which cut the journey by more than half. He had described the entrance, marked by a singular wind-twisted juniper tree that looked like a praying man. She had to try. She scribbled a hasty note for Marshal Shaw, hoping he would pass by, as he'd promised, detailing Thorne's plot. She left it nailed to her door. Saddling the ever-reliable Jezebel, she set off into the treacherous dark, praying she could find the landmark Honovi had described. Meanwhile, Marshal Shaw was not idle. In the town of Red Creek, he wasn't just investigating Thorne's recent activities. He was investigating Thorne himself. Something about the man's arrogance felt off, like he was overcompensating for a hidden weakness. Shaw had sent a telegram to the U.S. Marshal's Central Records Office in Fort Smith, Arkansas, with Thorne's description and any known aliases. He rode out towards the Finch homestead the next afternoon to check on Abby and found her note. His face went grim as he read it. The stampede was not just a possibility, it was happening. He spurred his horse not towards the Hopi lands, but towards Red Rock Canyon, a natural choke point through which the cattle would have to be funneled. He knew Thorn would be there to watch his handiwork. Abby found Echo Pass just as the sun began to rise, its entrance almost invisible against the canyon wall. The journey through it was harrowing, a tight squeeze through towering rock walls, but she emerged on the other side with the Hopi mesas in sight. She pushed Jezebel to her limit, arriving at the village as the elders were gathering for their morning council. Panting and dust-covered, she burst in and found Honovi. "Thorn," she gasped. "He's going to stampede his herd. Tonight! Through your cornfields!" A wave of alarm spread through the council. Honovi's face hardened. There was no time to move the women and children. They had to stop the herd. He gave a series of rapid commands. Within minutes, a party of 20 mounted warriors was assembled, armed with rifles and a fierce determination to protect their homes. Abby, refusing to be left behind, was given a fresh pony and rode with them. They galloped back towards the valley, Honovi leading them through another series of ancient paths. They arrived at the mouth of the valley just as the sun began to set, casting long, ominous shadows. In the distance they could hear it, a low, growing rumble. The stampede had begun. From a high vantage point, Thorn and 2 of his most loyal men watched their faces lit by the dying sun. Thorn held a lit cigar, a satisfied smirk on his face. Victory was at hand. Suddenly, a voice cut through the air. "That's far enough, Thorn." Thorn spun around. On the ridge behind him sat Marshal Everett Shaw, his shotgun held loosely but pointedly in Thorn's direction. Marshal Thorn said, his voice dangerously smooth. "Enjoying the sunset, I'd enjoy it more if I wasn't about to arrest you for conspiracy to destroy property and incite a riot," Shaw said calmly. Thorn laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You have no proof. It's my word against a hysterical woman and a band of primitives." "Oh, I think I have a bit more than that," Shaw said, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. A telegram. Took a while for the reply to get back from Fort Smith. "Seems they know a man matching your description. A man with a taste for land, grabs, and bullying. But they don't know him as Jedediah Thorn. They know him as Alistair Blackwood, a banker from St. Louis who embezzled a fortune from his clients and fled west after setting fire to the bank to cover his tracks. There's a federal warrant for your arrest that's 10 years old." The smirk vanished from Thorn's or Blackwood's face. He was exposed. The carefully constructed identity he had built was shattered. All the power, all the fear he commanded was based on a lie. His eyes darted around, looking for an escape. He saw none. In that moment of desperation, his hand dropped to his pistol. It was the mistake Shaw had been waiting for. But before Thorn could even clear leather, another sound split the air. Not a gunshot. A war cry. From the mouth of the valley below, Honovi and his riders appeared. They weren't charging the cattle. They were firing their rifles into the air, creating a wall of sound. They yelled, they waved blankets, a terrifying, chaotic display. The lead cattle, already spooked, shied away from the noise and the fire. The stampede, deprived of its leaders, began to break, turning back on itself in confusion. The herd was being turned. Up on the ridge, seeing his plan crumble and his past exposed, Alistair Blackwood made his choice. He wasn't going to hang. He spurred his horse not at Shaw, but toward the canyon edge, a sheer drop of 500 feet. Thorn no Shaw yelled, but it was too late. Blackwood and his horse leaped into the abyss, a final desperate act of defiance. They disappeared into the deep shadows below. The other two henchmen, seeing their boss gone and a U.S. Marshal before them, threw down their guns and surrendered immediately. The rumbling from the valley subsided, replaced by the victorious cries of the Hopi warriors. Down below, Abby sat on her pony between Honovi and his men, watching the last of the cattle turn and flee. The cornfields were safe. The valley was safe. As Marshal Shaw led his two new prisoners away, he looked down at the woman who had risked everything. She had not fired a shot, but she had won the war. The aftermath was quiet, almost unnaturally so. The thunder of the stampede was replaced by the whisper of the wind through the saved corn stalks. Jedediah Thorne or Alistair Blackwood, as the territory now knew him, was gone. His body shattered at the bottom of Red Rock Canyon. His empire, built on lies and intimidation, crumbled overnight. His men scattered, his cattle were impounded by the marshal's office to be sold at auction, and the T-Bar Ranch was seized as part of the federal case against him. Marshal Shaw officially closed the case. He declared that Thorne, acting alone in a fit of madness, had attempted to destroy Hopi property and had taken his own life when confronted. He made sure the official record noted Abigail Finch's role as a heroic citizen who had prevented a tragedy. Sheriff Brody, thoroughly disgraced by his association with a wanted federal embezzler, quietly resigned and left the territory. Abby returned to her homestead, the journey back feeling vastly different from the desperate ride out. She was no longer just a survivor clinging to a patch of dirt. She was a part of the landscape's story. When she arrived, she found Honovi and two of his men waiting for her on the porch. They had repaired her fence, which had been damaged by Thorne's men weeks before, and had refilled her water barrels from a hidden spring she never knew existed. There were no grand speeches. Words were not Honovi's way. He simply stood before her as she dismounted from the tired pony. "The people thank you," he said, his voice resonating with a deep sincerity. "The corn will feed the children this winter because of your courage. Our home is safe. Your home was never mine to save." Abby replied, stroking Jezebel's dusty neck, "I just warned my friends that a snake was in their path." Honovi allowed a rare, small smile to touch his lips. He looked at her small sod house, at the gifts that still adorned her porch. "This land has a way of testing a person's heart," he said, his gaze sweeping over the horizon. "Yours is strong, like the roots of the juniper tree." He placed a hand over his own heart in a gesture of profound respect, then mounted his pony. "You are not alone, Abigail Finch. Remember that." He and his men rode away, leaving her in the peaceful silence of her own land. But the silence was different now. It was no longer the sound of isolation. It was the sound of peace. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. The threat was gone. The shadow of the T-Bar no longer loomed over her. But the gifts remained. Abby used the corn and beans, baked the picky bread, and drank from the beautiful clay pot. They were more than sustenance. They were a living treaty, a daily reminder of the bond she had forged. Occasionally, she would find a small pouch of herbs left on her porch rail, or a brace of rabbits cleaned and ready for the pot. She, in turn, would sometimes leave a jar of her own wild berry preserves, or a few extra eggs, where she knew a Hopi shepherd might pass. It was a quiet, unspoken language of friendship and mutual respect. She never became one of them, and they never tried to be like her. She remained the homesteader, they the people of the mesas. But the invisible line that had once divided their worlds had been blurred, redrawn by shared danger and mutual courage. One evening, as a gentle sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and lilac, a peaceful contrast to the bloody red of that fateful day, Abby sat on her porch. She held a warm cup of tea, looking out at her small but thriving corn patch. She was still a woman alone, and life was still hard work. But she was not lonely. Her home was no longer just a 160-acre plot of land defined by a federal surveyor. It was a place anchored in the community, respected by her neighbors, and protected by a promise that weighed more than all the gold in the territory. The porch, once a symbol of her vulnerability, was now her throne, a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest treasures are not the ones you seek, but the ones that are given when you least expect them under a wide and watchful western sky. The story of Abigail Finch and the Hopi child is a powerful testament to the fact that in the harshest of landscapes, the strongest alliances can be forged. It's a reminder that courage isn't about the absence of fear, but about acting in spite of it. Her simple act of human decency didn't just save a life. It brought down a corrupt empire and built a bridge of respect between two cultures. The gifts left on her porch were more than just a reward. They were a symbol that echoes through time, a message that kindness is a currency that even the most remote and unforgiving frontiers understand and honor. If this story of unexpected heroism and quiet strength moved you, please give this video a thumbs up. It helps us share these incredible tales with more people. Don't forget to share this piece of the Old West with your friends and family. And most importantly, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next story from the annals of history. We're dedicated to uncovering the forgotten legends and unsung heroes of the past. Thank you for listening.